Thanks, John, and thanks for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm speaking about an initiative called Say Less, Show More that we hope is going to prove a cheap, feasible, easy-to-use initiative to improve the care we offer people with intellectual disability across the lifespan. And I'm really pleased that Mary McCaskill's in the audience today because she was certainly a key part of some of the important work that I'm going to talk about today. I also have some postcards and some posters if you'd like to take those. And if you want to look at some of the visuals, I've got copies of these, but I'll need to take these back with me. So it's not really until we speak to people with intellectual disability or their carers and listen to some of the stories that they tell that we really get a much clearer impression about how difficult it is for them to access the health system. So through the Agency for Clinical Innovation, we talked to some parents of people with a disability, and Tony's mother told us this. She said that he gets really distressed if he doesn't know the person and when they touch him without first explaining what they are going to do and how. Normally people go to the doctor and we know that the doctor will examine us. Tony doesn't know this. So if this happens with no warning, he'll be upset. Emphasising just how important explanation and communication is for people with a developmental disability, particularly if they have communication impairment. And sometimes we can easily overlook that. It's also important that all of us as clinicians in the health system will treat children and adults with intellectual disability. I'm a paediatrician, so I often say children, but most of what I'm going to talk about through this presentation will be equally applicable to adults, we assume. We know that children and adults with intellectual disability have poorer health and many treatable health conditions. Recent research from Julian Troller suggested the median life expectancy was 54 years compared to over 80 years in the general population, a very substantial life reduction, with 38% of the causes of death being potentially treatable. On average, we know that people with intellectual disability have 5 health conditions, with at least half of those being undetected and not treated. So if you're seeing someone in the emergency department, it's very likely they will have undetected health conditions that may well be contributing to their presentation. There's also evidence that they have higher rates of hospitalisation and presentation to the emergency department, both for young children and for adults in general with developmental disabilities. And importantly, not all children, and perhaps not even all adults, have been diagnosed as having an intellectual or developmental disability. So it's always worth bearing that in mind, that that too may be contributing to a complex presentation. Oops, wrong button. We know developmental disabilities are reasonably common. Intellectual disability occurs in 1 to 2% of the population, but if we look at all developmental disabilities, this data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare shows in younger children up to 9% of children might have a developmental disability. And the prevalence changes with different ages. So about half of children with a disability will have a profound or severe disability which significantly impacts their activities of daily living, in which they require more help to do ordinary things in daily life, including communicating with other people. And 1/5 of people have a moderate or mild disability. You might hear different labels or terms to describe people with intellectual disability, but importantly, the community is expecting us to recognise that they are people first, and that's how we should refer to them whenever we talk about people with developmental disabilities. Importantly, one of the very relevant aspects of developmental disabilities is that communication can often be significantly impaired. This applies to children and adults. This slide shows something of the development of communication through the early childhood years, from using pointing or gestures at about 12 months of age. And often prior to this, although some children may be using some words, many children prior to 10 months of age won't be able to specifically indicate what they want or need. By 12 to 18 months, 15 to 18 months, typically children are using single words and able to communicate what they want to another person quite simply. And by 2 to 3 years of age, they're using phrases. And what you might see described for older people with a developmental disability is an age equivalent of their communication skills. And so many people with a more significant, moderate or severe disability might have communication skills in one of these ranges. So if you know somebody's communicating less than 12 months of age, it's very likely they may not understand specific words or be able to use specific words, or might not be able to specifically indicate what they want or need. I mean, they still will have a range of needs, but they might not be able to specifically indicate that. So even though there are communication impairments, and we know that this leads to difficulties with accessing the health system and treatment and diagnosis of health conditions, there's actually limited support for children with developmental disabilities in healthcare. And only about 5%, in a survey that the ECI did a few years ago, only a very small proportion of local health districts actually offer routine, reasonable adjustments for people with developmental disabilities. So some services and some departments have tried to make some adaptations and providing some play therapists, using some distractions for procedures and using some stories. But these are only ad hoc and usually provided by a non-clinician, somebody else who's come in to support the person. In some areas where the developmental disability team has a significant leadership role, there might be some use of visuals. But what's very clear is that it's very sporadic. And importantly, there's little or no clinician use or training in the use of visuals. So when we talk about communication, we use a variety of means to communicate. Most importantly, for sophisticated concepts, it's words, but we might also be using gestures, body language, eye contact, and the general environmental context. When we talk about visuals, they can be simple pictures like these, which are taken from Boardmaker, or they might even be photos, and most of us have got smartphones with cameras, so it's easier for parents and other people to take photos that can be used to help communicate what's going to happen. So at the most simple level, it might be just a single picture, such as a stop sign or a wait sign or a finish, to mean that an activity's ended. Or it might be a sequence of pictures starting from the two at the top, so something's going to happen, then something else will happen. And if that second event is desirable, it might be motivating for the person to comply with the first request before getting the second. And many of you will be familiar with these simple behavioural techniques, but representing them in simple pictures like this can be very helpful for people with disabilities. So the project that we developed was building on partnerships that were developing as part of the NDIS rollout. And the NDIS is very clear that the expectation is that mainstream health services will improve the inclusion of people with developmental disabilities. So the partnership for this project included people with disability and their carers, most importantly, non-government agencies and the Disability Department ADIC, which is now in the process of closing down, and the Early Childhood Intervention Association, and importantly, local health districts and the Agency for Clinical Innovation Intellectual Disability Network. And we were all working towards improved care and improved access for people with developmental disabilities. And our focus in this part of the project was on children, but as you'll see, we're starting to look at relevant supports for adults as well. So at the outset, the steering group felt that 3 visuals for 3 types of health encounters was most worthwhile for young children with a disability. The first was taking blood or putting in a cannula. The second was a physical examination, and we had some highly trained models for us through these pictures. And the family of these 2 children, in fact there was an older brother as well, was really keen and supportive of this project, having access to the health system, and also the dentist. And it was felt by parents and people who support disability that these can be very distressing experiences for children with a developmental disability. So we involved parents in developing these visuals. We involved real volunteers as well as health staff at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, particularly in the emergency department and the dental department there. And what parents, they provided specific advice on how to, what worked in the visuals and in the stories for their children. But importantly, 82% of these parents, that is parents of children with a disability accessing early intervention service, felt that their child would benefit from seeing these pictures when they went to the doctor or to see the dentist. And they also felt it was important for health professionals to use them. So some parents said to us that their child would love to share a story with their nurse or doctor, and that it was also helpful for them to be able to use these visuals prior to going to the appointment. So we have developed these resources, and they are now freely available on the internet, and you're welcome to have these slides if you'd like. You can Google Say Less Show More, but it's part of an ACI website. We've also developed an e-learning module based on the PowerPoint that we used in the emergency department at Westmead, with funds from ADDIC, so we're really appreciative of that, and some tip sheets that include some advice, some thoughts from our experience introducing to the ED at Westmead. But also, if you want to develop your own visuals, there are some tips provided by a specialised speech pathologist with very extensive experience in the non-government sector. So just to speak a little bit more about the project we did, introducing the visuals into the paediatric emergency department. First of all, it was the partnership that I've already spoke about that was really crucial to developing this project, and some sustained and ongoing partnerships that are extending the work elsewhere. First of all, it was important to have some local champions, and senior medical staff, Mary McCaskill as head of the ED was certainly one of the most important, but also the nursing staff were very actively involved. And one of the nurses in particular was key to this project and undertook some more extensive training and support by visiting one of the early intervention centres to see how visuals were used and how parents were using them and how children were responding. We undertook some staff training after developing a PowerPoint in consultation with the specialist speech pathologist and the staff at the ED. And that was introduced through a variety of means, often at handover or in some other formal training, or opportunistically. The staff training was also supported by some coaching by the nurse, local champion, when they were actually being introduced, and that was a vital component as well. The visuals were introduced into clinical practice, and we decided to trial them with children who were under 6 and other children with a developmental disability. So the experience that I'll talk about, the feedback, reflects that group of children. And we tried to evaluate both of those components, and the sustained partnerships, I think, will be helpful in maintaining this sort of work. And it was only this morning I was speaking to a mother of a boy with a very severe disability who's had a lot of health problems as a result of neuroblastoma when he was about 18 months of age. And she still appreciates the support that's available through the emergency department, that is in part demonstrated by the posters about this project, Say Less Show More, that are visible in the emergency department. The baseline survey that we undertook of 54 medical and 45 nursing staff indicated that most said they had a moderate amount of knowledge of disability, but most indicated that they really didn't have any experience or knowledge of visuals to support communication. So the evaluation from the staff about both the teaching, the training and the use of visuals was overall very positive. And you can read some of these comments here, but in general 80% thought the visuals were relevant for the task at hand, 86% thought that they were easy to use, and about 86% would use them again or recommend them to a colleague. And I can show you some more about the visuals, and we've got some nurses speaking about their experience as well that I can show you in a moment. And what was also worthwhile was that noting was the benefit was not just restricted to children with a developmental disability. Parents of young children in general, parents of children who were from cold backgrounds, and other children who were presenting very distressed with mental health problems also benefited. So it's an intervention that was designed to support people with disability, but is probably relevant for other vulnerable populations where communication may be impaired for whatever range of reasons. So some of the staff said that the training and use made them more aware of the needs of children with disabilities and how they can help with their hospitalisation. They thought that these tools were very good, that it recognised the importance of how children with disabilities learn best and will improve experiences for them and their parents. And importantly, one nurse, I think, said that they were sceptical of the benefits of the tool, and they were planning to cannulate a child presenting with behavioural issues who was very stressed about the procedure. The tool completely calmed the child. They had been planning to use sedation, but it wasn't needed due to the effectiveness of the tool. And then they wanted the tool available for other procedures that they thought was distressing within the emergency department. We also asked parents about their experience seeing their child used or supported by visuals in the emergency department. And again, parents indicated very strongly that they felt that this was a very worthwhile and important initiative. Over 80% indicated that visuals assisted at least to a moderate degree their child to better understand the procedure. And almost all, at least 93% agreed or strongly agreed that visuals were easy to use. And 88% agreed that doctors and nurses should use visuals to help their child understand what is going to happen. So very overwhelmingly, parents are telling us, even parents of children without a disability, that they find them very helpful and they want them used. Now, I'm not going to stand here and say they're necessary for every child or that they will necessarily resolve all the problems that a child with a disability will have. But it is one simple tool that will help improve communication for children with a disability. And we'd argue that it's both feasible and cheap and practical for clinicians to be able to use them. But I do think it's important that clinicians have some context about using them so they're used appropriately. So I've just got 2 videos of some nurses who use them in the emergency department, so hopefully this will work.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I work in the emergency department as a nurse. Before becoming a nurse, I actually worked in autism and disabilities, and we used PET cards and visual aids quite frequently. I always found them really helpful when working with kids. When I first started at the Children's Hospital in emergency, we didn't actually have anything to use as visual aids. I think the books themselves settle the child down, and it makes the procedure a story, and I think that's really comforting for children. When we just explain things verbally, it's a bit confusing. They don't know what we're talking about. We tend to use terms that only we really understand. And just having the photos there in a book really brings that back down to a story time, and parents can sit there and tell the story, and then they go in and they always seem to be much more calm after they've read the book.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm a registered nurse currently working at the Children's Hospital at Westmead. I'm currently involved in a visual aids project that helps alleviate any stresses or anxiety with procedures that we do at the hospital, such as venipunctures, cannulations, and everyday examinations a doctor would do, such as checking the ears, nose and throat. All those procedures can be quite daunting to both their parents and the children, so we have 2 mediums that we use to help alleviate their stress and anxiety. The first one we use is an iPad. The iPad I found quite useful, especially those children with maybe behavioural disorders or learning difficulties. It helps get them through the procedures page by page, and it's more interactive. And the second one is a book, which I find quite useful for those children that may not necessarily have those learning difficulties but are able to read through with their parents before a procedure is done. In regards to how well it's worked, I give it a 10 out of 10.
So visuals can be used in a range of ways, but what's important is to tailor them to the abilities of the child. So it might be that a single picture might need to be presented to the child paired with the actual event. Some children are able to read through a story and then remember what they are told, and then that will be sufficient for them to understand what's going on with the procedure. And other parents may choose to show what is going to happen to the child ahead of time. And as you can imagine, a whole range of different visuals could be developed, from showing the site and the people who are going to be involved in the story or the health intervention. So mostly what happened during this project was showing the child the story of what's going to happen immediately before or during the actual medical intervention. But as you've heard, some parents want to be able to show their child ahead of time before they actually come into the healthcare context. And so parents are able to access these online as well. So in conclusion, our experience shows that we know there are significant barriers to care for children with developmental disabilities, and these continue to exist. And that is, our health system hasn't really responded in the way that we know is important. And hopefully this tool is one way we can help reduce the health inequalities that exist. The experience in the emergency department at Westmead suggests it's easy and feasible for mainstream clinicians to learn how to use these, and that they can be actually used in routine clinical practice. We also found that parents want them used, so the parents of children with a disability and also parents of children presenting at the emergency department are keen for these to be used in healthcare environments. And it's quite likely that visuals are able to be one tool that can address the significant barriers that exist for people with disability. So we're continuing to try and extend this piece of work into other contexts to see what the benefits are, to see if they're feasible. So I'm now employed by the Sydney Local Health District, and we're looking at introducing these visuals into a mainstream emergency department with young children at Canterbury Hospital, and also in the dental department and community paediatrics. I know there are other people who are probably also likely to be interested. We're trying to increase awareness of these resources, and we've disseminated information at a variety of conferences and in the primary care sector, but we're still hoping that they become part of our routine tools, just as we are taught how to use interpreters when we're communicating with people who aren't proficient in English. We would hope that clinicians are also able to use these tools with people who need these sorts of resources and benefits. At Ryde Hospital, there's some development of visuals for adults with developmental disabilities currently underway. The photos have been taken and they're being put together. And that will include not just these three scenarios, but also some perioperative and imaging scenarios that were thought to be very relevant by the staff, particularly the nursing staff at Ryde Hospital. So this is just a glimpse at some of the photos that have been taken. And the fellow who is the model here is very excited and spoke to our ECI ID network meeting the other day with a stethoscope round his neck. So that was really good. So he's very keen to support the work some more, as is his mother. So we're really grateful of Ryde Hospital cooperating and supporting this work. And just to recognise that this is a collaborative project with quite a number of members. So the people on the left-hand side are those who were intimately involved with the project at the Children's Hospital at Westmead. That included paediatric registrars, nurses, as well as members of some non-government agencies, Lifestyle and Karana and ADDIC. And then the people on the right have joined us through the project development at Ryde Hospital. And of course we hope that the number of people involved with these projects will continue to grow. So I've brought some postcards which gives you a little bit more information that includes some behavioural tips for working with children with developmental disabilities and some posters, and you're certainly welcome to take those. I must apologise, they were printed before we had the website, so the website isn't on those, but they still may be helpful, and you can easily Google "Say Less, Show More." So I'm very happy to answer any questions, but Mary's also here, so it's also helpful to hear from somebody who is actually intimately involved and working in the ED about these tools. So thank you. Or perhaps Mary could make some comment.
Thanks, Jackie. It was quite an exciting project because I'd actually never heard of visuals until Jackie came and told me about them. So essentially what we did is we printed out the pictures which had a photo of what was happening and sometimes a word underneath, and then we laminated them. So they were really high tech. You had laminated things that you showed people, which meant that they snotted on them, you could clean it off. And it was really quite effective. When you're looking at a child's ears, how they scream at you, and so you'd actually just show them the picture of what you're doing, and then you'd do it. And we found with children, pre-verbal children or under 6 years of age, particularly the 3-4-year-olds. They quite liked the idea of pictures, and they'd look at it and then you'd do it, and that was what they expected. And it was quite interesting how their response was different as opposed to the usual hold them down, quick look in the ear, in the throat, which I'm quite good at doing, but now I really quite like using the visuals. So what we did, we kept it on the nurse's desk, and so when you'd have a child, you just grab it and then use it and then put it back, usually, although occasionally it gets lost, like everything in emergency.